Hi. First slide. So I wanted to talk to you tonight about a few ideas and themes that drive my practice, ordinary architecture. The first of which, perhaps most obviously, is ordinariness. Not much modern architecture by architects is generally referred to as ordinary in a complimentary way, although it has occasionally been used to describe a set of values, such as Alison and Peter Smithson's essay Ordinariness and Delight on the design of Robin Hood Gardens, and Venturi Scott Brown's theories of the ugly and ordinary. But we find ordinary art and architecture created by those outside of high cultural institutions can be rich with meaning and qualities that resist architecture's tendency towards abstract value. And it's also often full of extraordinary delights. So we love ordinary things that aren't always considered architecture with a capital A or of high aesthetic merit. A blinking neon seafront sign or a particularly convivial traditional pub. Extraordinary architecture can be found in some very ordinary places. Here is just some images of some of our favourite sites near our office in Bethnal Green that we took when we were invited to take over the Architects Journal Instagram account recently. An account that's kind of typically filled with images of pristine white models and sleek modern architecture. We messed up their feed with such delight as an East End cafe, 2 front doors, and a pie and mash shop. So when we were invited by the RIBA Journal to write a monthly column, we took it as an opportunity to explore and enjoy some of these ordinary architectural typologies a bit more. So, for example, the greengrocers. The objects on sale here form the structure, the architecture, and the ornamentation. Bunches of bananas, grapes, and pineapples become living Corinthian capitals. The caravan, a modest attempt at escapism and a desire to bring as much of your home with you on holiday as possible. Yet also indisputably ingenious pieces of design that, if it weren't for their association with suburban bad taste, would actually press most architects' buttons. The pleasure pier. They lead us literally nowhere, but the journey is full of flashing lights and music and the promise of illicit thrills. The British seaside is actually a really good place to look for very un-British architecture, buildings freed from a conservative fear of the new or simply too much insufferable good taste. And lastly, the minicab office, lurking above cafes and shops, tucked behind train stations and underneath railway arches. This example is almost like some kind of minimalist art installation, a glass window inserted into a wall, backlit signs flickering across the dirty brickwork. So our obsession with ordinariness extends to an interest in folk art and architecture, in user adaptation, and in the undesigned. Which brings us to the question constantly, how can we, as architects, positively approach the idea of ordinary architecture? Currently, much of this thinking exists in our research and teaching. So this year I'm running an undergraduate studio at Westminster University called the Village Model that is exploring the anatomy and physiognomy of the quintessential English village as a viable archetype for contemporary urban development. Is it possible to learn from the everyday qualities of architecture to create extraordinary spaces and places? This is perhaps the main question that drives our current practice. Now for a quick glimpse of a recent project that explores another of our interests, radical decoration, as we call it, and which has been described as a fantastic example of extraordinary architecture. So it's the House for Essex. A sparkling jewel situated in the humble working landscape of the Essex countryside. This house is the result of a design collaboration with the artist Grayson Perry and our former practice FAT, which we were novated to complete as ordinary on site last year. So we see it as an antidote to minimalism, which, to quote Grayson Perry, has become so kitsch these days. Sorry to the first speaker. Another project we were shortlisted to, I completely forgot to whiz through the images, sorry. So the roof sculptures, the glazed ceramic tiles, and the extravagantly detailed interiors are abundant with decorative motifs, ornamentation, and lush materiality. Another project we were recently shortlisted to design was the new members' room for the V&A, which gave us an opportunity to explore a bit more of our ideas around the idea of radical decoration. So we got to mine the V&A's collection of decorative and applied art objects, and we became obsessed with all these beautiful examples of marquetry. And we developed an idea around a palette of contemporary pop graphics realised using traditional marquetry techniques. Unfortunately, we came second, losing to a much more sensible and tasteful design by Carmody Groark. But we haven't lost hope that this scheme may still be realised in another guise one day, perhaps with the V&A who we're continuing to work with. Right, it's a shame I couldn't bring any images, but right now we're designing their exhibition for their new pavilion at the Venice Biennale this year. It's too early to kind of show any images, but it's all super exciting and coming soon, so watch this space. And then finally, I wanted to show you a project that captures another interest of ours, which is storytelling and narrative, which we use both as a tool and as inspiration in much of our design work. So this is a project called, excuse me, sorry. This is a project called Fallen Icon, which was a public art installation that took place in the city of Los Angeles. And it was one of a series of outdoor events staged by a local design collective called On the Road. This was the final event, and it took place in what was probably the most dramatic location, the Mount Lee Trail leading up to the Hollywood sign. The sign itself has a really fascinating story. It was originally erected in the 1920s as an advertisement for a real estate housing development called Hollywood Land. It was made of really cheap materials and wasn't built to last, so the sign fell into disrepair over the years until in the 1970s when Hugh Hefner saved the day, raising the $250,000 needed to rebuild it. And its heritage status has been fiercely guarded ever since by the very famous local residents. But it's been iconised in film, in advertising, and even by some local authorities who are perhaps seeking to inject just a little bit of glamour into their local community. It's a site that's very close to home for me as well, so I'm really fond of that. It's also a site of inspiration for artists. Ed Richet's back of the Hollywood sign, shown here, as well as being a backdrop for pop music videos and album covers. And it's maintained its iconic status in the holiday snaps and selfies taken by the hundreds of tourists that hike the trail every day today. So I wanted to try and capture this rich history and also its contemporary condition in our installation. When I visited the site, at first I experienced the kind of the fragility of the landscape, its crumbling hillside and falling rocks. And then after this long, grueling trek, when you reach the top, you realise that you can't actually get close to the sign at all. You end up behind it. You can't touch it. You can't kind of get close to it. You can't have your photo taken with it. So it felt really important to make the sign accessible to the people who go to visit it. So we decided to recreate the letters on a more human scale and scatter them up the trail, the public trail, with a series of viewfinders that told this story of how the letters might have tumbled down the hill. We made the viewfinders from really simple materials bought at the local Home Depot store, and we constructed the giant letters by hand from foam board and a hot glue gun. That's me making a Y. Then we packed them into the backs of trucks and we took them up the hill. And there's no vehicles allowed after a certain point, so they had to be physically carried up for the last part, which actually resulted in some of the most epic images from the day, from the installation. Nothing quite like the sight of a giant L being carried up this incredible landscape with this amazing kind of city backdrop. So the idea was that passers-by would come across a giant letter in their pathway, accompanied by a viewfinder, and they would first stop and approach the letter, hug it, hold it, climb into it, have their photo taken with it. And they did, really successfully. So exactly the kind of result that was intended happened. We got some great photos from the day, Instagram and Facebook throughout the day. And then they would approach the viewfinder, which showed an image of the genuine view looking up towards the sign at that point. And then each one was photoshopped to remove the letters from the sign one by one. So at first there's an H missing, a couple of O's missing, a few more, until there's just a Y at the top, and then there's no letters at all. So after the event, the letters were carried back down the hill one by one and temporarily reappropriated as seating for the after party. And then eventually the foam board became formwork for a concrete pour that transformed this temporary installation into a permanent piece of public art, kind of like a petrified ruin of its former self that's now used as seating in a parking lot near the bottom of the hill. And we love this. We love that this second life has become like a wonderful part of the total narrative, one that was unplanned and undesigned, but is all the more beautiful for it. And that is where I will end tonight.